When Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, the Talmud tells us that the angels complained to God. And they said, why are you giving the Torah to mortal men? Why are you giving it to creatures that are so likely to not keep the Torah? Why don't you keep the Torah here in heaven? And the Talmud continues that God says to Moses, give them an answer. And Moses' answer was a very logical one. You want the Torah? Look what it says in the Torah. I am the God, your God, who was taking you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Were you slaves in the land of Egypt? And he went on, one commandment after the other, showing them that it's irrelevant to them. Do you work 6 days of the week, that you have to rest on Shabbos? Do you have a father and mother? Are you tempted to kill or steal? Etc. And God, therefore, overruled the objection of the angels and gave the Torah to the Jewish people. The truth is that the angels didn't complain about the Torah for the first time, or complain about mortals for the first time. Before God even created man, we're taught, it's in the Torah, where God says, let us make man. Who is the us over here? There's only one God. So Rashi explains that God was referring to the angels to teach us humility, that whenever you have to make a major decision in life, you consult with others, even if they're inferior to you. Of course, God is superior to the angels, but nevertheless, he consulted with them. And what was their response? Ma enosh kisizkerenu. Why are you even thinking about a human being, a fickle creation who is unreliable, who is most likely going to mess up and not do what he's supposed to do? Don't create the human being. And God overruled them, and he created humanity. And then, when Adam partook of the forbidden fruit, the very first commandment that a human being was given, they said, we told you so. Look what you created. You can't rely on this creature called a human being. And then when Cain killed Abel, they most likely rolled their eyes and says, look what's going on over here. A brother kills a brother. And then when the waters of the flood had to destroy the world, we could assume that the angels were rolling their eyes, again, their angelic eyes, and saying, God, why did you conduct this very flawed experiment with humanity? It makes no sense. And then when God finally is ready to give the Torah, they also complained. And Moses demonstrated to them the Torah was not relevant to them. There's another account of the dialogue between Moses and the angels in the Midrash. And it connects to this week's Torah portion, Vayera. When Moses was trying to demonstrate to the angels that the Torah was not for them, but for us, he referred to an incident that happened hundreds of years before the giving of the Torah that we read about in this week's Torah portion. In last week's Torah portion, we read that Abraham circumcised himself, and now he's sitting at the entrance of his tent, ailing, still from circumcision. God appears to him, but it's extremely hot, and no one is traveling, and Abraham was distressed. So our sages tell us, and Rashi quotes this, that Abraham was so into serving guests and showing hospitality and extending his kindness to others that God didn't want to trouble him right after, a few days after he had undergone circumcision at the age of 99. And so God made it so hot that no one would be traveling. But then Abraham was even more distressed. And we have to presume that God knew this, but God wanted to demonstrate to us the extent to which Abraham's kindness would go, that his distress at not having guests was more painful than having to run around just having undergone circumcision 3 days earlier at the age of 99. At any rate, so what does God do? It's very hot, no one's going to travel. So he sent 3 angels disguised as humans, and Abraham treated them to an elaborate gourmet feast. And the Torah describes exactly what he served them. And what did he serve them? Dairy and meat. They ate dairy and meat. So Moses, like a good lawyer, turns to the angels and he says, you had an opportunity hundreds of years ago. You were in the house of Abraham and you violated that law of the Torah. Now you could ask, how did they know the laws of the Torah? The answer is the laws of the Torah were known even before the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. Even Noah knew Torah because the Torah tells us that he was told to take 2 of the non-kosher animals, the impure ones, and 7 of the pure ones. So obviously he had to know what was a kosher animal, what was not kosher. So the teachings of the Torah were revealed to individuals even before it was given at Mount Sinai. And indeed, the Talmud says that Abraham observed all the commandments in the way he could have observed them in those days before there was a Jewish nation and so on. For example, he baked matzah on Passover. He didn't say the Haggadah because if he said the Haggadah, he would have known the future history. Certainly he didn't read the part of the Torah where God tells him to take his son and sacrifice him because he would have known that it was only a test and it was not going to happen. At any rate, Abraham kept the Torah. And so the angels, we presume, also were aware of the commandments of the Torah before it was given, and they violated it. They did not observe it. So this was the argument that forced the angels to admit the Torah was not for them. The Torah was given to humanity. So let's try to understand why was the prohibition of mixing milk and meat the clincher. This was the commandment, the argument against the angels and for humanity. There must be something about this commandment specifically that is not just one of many commandments that they didn't observe, but it was a commandment that reflects the challenges that humanity has and that only human beings are capable of meeting that challenge because they wouldn't be given a challenge if they couldn't meet it, but angels don't have that challenge and therefore don't need the commandments. But before I go into the milk and meat dynamic and what it means and what the lesson from it happens to be, let's go back to the very beginning. The very beginning is creation. God created the world with a purpose. We're not going to go into it in great detail and great length, but just briefly to establish that God, the Creator, had a plan for the universe. The plan was to create a world, an independent world, at least a world in which God's presence is not assumed and commitment to God is not the natural state of a human being. A human being would be created a sentient being who has the ability to choose between good and evil. And God is going to give them a master plan that will lay out all of what he wants us to do and what he wants us not to do. He wants the general population to observe the 7 Noahide commandments. He wants the Jewish people to keep 613 commandments. And ultimately, when we fulfill the requisite amount of mitzvahs, of commandments over the millennia, this will lead to the purification of the world, and the world will become a dwelling place for God, and that will be the Messianic age. So there's a plan, and that plan started with creation, but more earnestly, it started with Abraham. Now, in order for God to give this plan to a human being, he has to give it to not just one human being, he has to give it to an entire universe. And in order to give it to the entire universe, he has to give it to the entire, all of humanity. And in order to give it to all of humanity, at least what they're capable of doing, he gives the master plan to the Jewish nation. And God has to now create and cultivate a Jewish nation. So there are 3 challenges that have to be capable of meeting. In other words, when God gives us a master plan, he expects us to be capable of meeting the demands of that plan. And therefore, we have to have an individual. We start with an individual who will meet the requirements. And in general, there are 3 requirements. One requirement is that a human being has to recognize God's sovereignty. He has to express himself or herself in ways that demonstrate that I accept that there's one God and that God is my master. And that entails also commitment to follow God's will. If someone says, I accept your authority, you're my boss, but I won't follow everything you tell me to do, then that's a sham acceptance of authority. And in order for us to really show that we accept God as our authority, we have to be prepared to commit ourselves to follow his directives, to follow his commandments. So that's condition number one. God creates Adam and then Eve, and they were given one commandment. That was a test case, and they violate it. They blow it. They could not resist the temptation to eat of the forbidden fruit, and God says, you cannot be the person from whom the nation that will be entrusted with a master plan shall emerge. We'll have to wait and see what will happen. The second objective, in order for God's plan to ever come to fruition, is that humanity, with all of their drives and all of their interests and all of their weaknesses, should be able to get along with one another. A world in which there is division and divisiveness and conflict, that's not a world in which God could manifest himself. In order for God to be present, there has to be an intact world, not a chaotic, anarchic world. Well, that was violated by Cain. Cain kills Abel. Very soon after creation, the next generation after Adam and Eve, they can't get along. And God says, well, obviously, there's something missing in society, and that kept on getting worse and worse until the great flood, which destroyed the whole world, demonstrating that the world was not yet ready to be given even a sample of the master plan. Abraham passes both of those tests with flying colors. Abraham accepts God's sovereignty. Abraham on his own discovers that there's one God, an unseeable God, a God that is the master of the universe, and commits his life to him and is prepared to die for him. In fact, the Midrash tells us that Abraham, when he was a young man, defied the idols and the idol-worshipping communities of that time, and he was brought before the king Nimrod, and Nimrod tried to get him to accept idolatry, and when he finally utterly refused, he was thrown into a fiery furnace, and miraculously he survived and emerged unscathed. But he was prepared to die for God, to fulfill God's commandment not to worship idols, one of the 7 Noahide commandments. So he passed that test and rectified that which Adam and Eve failed. And then the second test of getting along with others, of sowing unity instead of division in society, and Abraham passes that with flying colors as well. Abraham is a man of kindness, a man who reaches out to others, who shows love to others, who brings others into his home. He was the paragon of virtue, the paragon of kindness, to the extent that in the Kabbalistic writings it says that God's attribute of kindness complained to God, as it were, that I'm no longer employed, I'm out of business because Abraham took over from me. In other words, Abraham personified God's very trait of kindness. So he corrected that problem. But then there's a third problem that only Abraham corrected. And that is, yes, you can have respect for God, his sovereignty, total commitment to him. You could get along with others. You're not going to steal. You're not going to kill. You're not going to do things that will disrupt the harmony of the world and make the world inhospitable to God. But then, in order for you to be entrusted with a master plan, you have to have the ability to influence others, to touch others with your faith, with your commitment, with your love. And Noah, righteous man, Torah describes him as a righteous man, but he could not influence even one other person. Besides his immediate family, his wife, his 3 sons, and their spouses, nobody else survived the flood due to Noah's inability to influence them. He was given a task to build the ark, which would take him 120 years. And the idea was that he should get people curious. What is he doing? Why is he building this boat? And he would influence them to change their ways, but it didn't work. He had not succeeded. And therefore God says, Noah is a righteous man, but he can't be the person I will choose to start a family and then a nation that will be entrusted with a master plan. Abraham passed that test as well with flying colors. Abraham was an influencer. Abraham was able to reach out to thousands of people. And Sarah, by the way, when we talk about Abraham, he goes hand in hand with Sarah. The matriarchs and the patriarchs are like one unit. and they change the world for the first time. There's someone who was able to change the mindsets, the belief systems of thousands upon thousands of people. He didn't introduce monotheism. He introduced the idea of spreading monotheism, promoting monotheism, and the virtues that go along with belief in one God, such as the belief in kindness and justice. And therefore, God says to Abraham, you are the right person to begin this very great experiment or venture that will ultimately lead to the Messianic age that will make the world a complete and perfect and divinely present world. Okay, so now the angels are coming to Abraham's house. This is the person who is going to represent God's whole plan for the world. And they blow it by partaking of milk and meat. So what is it about milk and meat that shows that the angels could not be part of that plan? If you think about milk and meat, the reason why we don't mix milk and meat is obviously because it says so in the Torah. It's God's commandment, and if we had no reason for it, we would still do it purely because it's God's commandment. But there are reasons given. In other words, a commandment which is based on God's will could also have side benefits, fringe benefits, as they would say, that make the commandment more palatable to us and more meaningful and more inspirational to us. So there are three reasons given by mostly medieval commentators. One reason given by Maimonides is that mixtures of milk and meat are there to distance us from idol worship, the prohibition against mixing milk and meat. Because in the olden days, the pagans would cook a kid in the milk of its mother, and that would be part of their idolatrous rites. To distance ourselves from idolatry, Maimonides says God gave us several commandments that wean us off any attachment to idolatry. Keep away from anything that has a vestige, a reminder, even a remote reminder, a subtle reminder of idolatry. Keep away from it. And that's why milk and meat, the mixture of milk and meat, is so forbidden. It's unique. Not only is it forbidden to cook milk and meat, which is the way the Torah phrases it, it's forbidden to eat. Not only is it forbidden to eat, it's forbidden to even derive any benefit from. It's utterly out of our world. We cannot deal with it because it's idolatry. Well, that represents the first objective, the total rejection of anything else but the one God and the commitment and the fidelity to God's will. That's the first message of the milk and meat that the angels blew and they missed. The second reason given is that cooking a young animal in the milk of its mother is a very cruel thing. It's sadistic and cruel. And God wants to distance us from any trace of cruelty. Not only we shouldn't do anything that's cruel, we shouldn't even do things that are reminders of cruelty, something that keeps cruelty in our lexicon, it keeps cruelty in our thought processes. So God commands us, you see this ritual of cooking a kid in the milk of its mother, which is cruel. You can't even eat something that was a mixture of milk and meat, even if it wasn't cooked in the milk of its mother. Any type of connection to milk and meat is out of bounds for you, because you have to develop a sensitivity to the needs of others and not create a world in which there is conflict where one hurts the other. The angels, by eating milk and meat, they blew that. They demonstrated that that's not for them. And then the third reason given for not mixing milk and meat is that milk and meat represent different dynamic spiritual forces. Milk is the attribute of chesed, symbolizes kindness. Meat symbolizes gvura, judgment, harshness. And there are times when we fuse the two, but there are times when they become explosive. And the Torah tells us that milk and meat creates an explosion in society. A person who partakes of milk and meat together is doing something to harm the rest of society. That means a person has no regard for the environment, for the rest of the world, and therefore cannot influence others. That was the problem with Noach. that he could not save the world. He can only save himself and his immediate family. And a person who engages in eating, partaking of milk and meat, shows that they are also not conscientious about the rest of the world. And that was the third flaw that the angels exhibited by eating milk and meat, is that they did not have the sense of responsibility for the rest of the world, and therefore they couldn't be entrusted with the Torah. So the three reasons given for the prohibition of milk and meat represent the three objectives of why God created the world and what the whole purpose of the Torah is about. And therefore the angels, who are oblivious obviously to that, because they partook of something that symbolizes and encapsulates all of those three different objectives.